Good morning, everyone. I think we want to go ahead and get the program underway. So if everyone wants to take a seat, we'll get started shortly. So my name is Taylor Williams, and I am the granddaughter of Sue and Neil Williams. And I want to take a moment to welcome everyone to Alston and Bird for the third installment in the Neil Asks Lecture series, which is the series that has been established to kind of honor the legacy of my grandfather and to ask the questions that he was interested in for most of his life. We want to give a very special thank you to Print Pack, Acuity Brands, and the Vassar Woolley Foundation for their continued and very generous support of both neelasks.org and of the lecture series. We also want to remind everyone that this program will be videoed, so that will be available on neelasks.org shortly after the presentation today. My grandmom has also asked me to mention that we now have a Neil Asks group on LinkedIn. So if you are on LinkedIn and want to connect with Neil Asks that way, that is certainly an option. We are also very pleased to announce that the next installment, the fourth presentation in the Neil Asks program, will be held in early September. It is currently planned for September 18th, and that will be held over at the Duke Law School. And we want to thank Kate Buchanan, who has been absolutely instrumental in organizing that entire program there and kind of making sure that that program has gotten off the ground. So many of you may know, to me, my granddad was this kind of big, burly, perpetually happy man that could swing me around in his arms until the time I was about 19 years old. To others here, he was a philanthropist, he was an educational leader, a business leader, he was an arts enthusiast, but the place where he spent the majority of his professional life was here at Alston and Bird. So it's only fitting today that we are gathered here at the firm for a program on law, and it is also fitting that I introduce Richard Hayes, who has been with the law firm since 1986, shortly after my granddad became managing partner of the firm in 1984. Richard joined the firm as a trial lawyer, that's right, after attending Harvard undergraduate and then Vanderbilt for law school, and he became managing partner of the firm in 2007, where among his many accomplishments as managing partner, he has kept Alston and Bird on Fortune's 100 Best Places to Work list for 15 consecutive years. So I know that's something that the firm is happy about and that we owe to Richard here. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you again and get this program underway.
Great, okay. Well, thank you. It is really an enormous treat to be here and to be able to participate in this. And so thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Sue. Thanks to everyone who makes this possible. It's especially, I guess, a delight to be here with Judge Martin and Ben. As people know, Judge Martin is on the 11th Circuit, was appointed in 2010, and before that had a rich and long history in the system as a district court judge, also as an assistant U.S. attorney, as well as U.S. attorney in the Middle District, the assistant attorney general, and also in private practice. And so thank you for being here and sharing your insights with us. And also Ben. Delighted to have Ben. And Ben, when I started, as Taylor said, Neil was the managing partner. And he was the managing partner until 2007. And then Ben became the managing partner. And is one of the few people I know who woke up when he was 65 and decided he wasn't working hard enough. And so what he does now is run even faster. And so I guess one of the prerogatives of being the current managing partner is I get to look at the former managing partner and say, Ben, why don't you facilitate this discussion?
Okay. All right. What we're going to do is we're just going to have a conversation among the three of us for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we have microphones, so if anybody wants to make a speech or ask a question or point out the things we left unsaid or the things we said that we shouldn't have said, we'll have time to do that. And then after that, I really would encourage everybody to stick around for a few minutes and enjoy each other's company. And we have a lot of friends, new and old, who are here today. And most of us, a lot of us share an interest in the law. Most of us share a relationship with Neil Williams. And as Taylor pointed out, Neil was many, many, many things. And he touched a lot of people in different ways. And I think it would be maybe useful just to ask Beverly, you know, how was it that you came to know Neil? And then it may be that Richard and I will say a few words along that line as well.
Well, I had the pleasure of sitting with Neil and Sue at a dinner not long after I went from a very busy trial court to the Court of Appeals, where I was busy with people bringing me paper to read instead of interacting with people. And I think the way that Neil befriended me, it probably answers the question, what is, in one of the ways that he did, what is our responsibilities to the profession beyond what we do for our clients? Because as I sat there that evening as kind of a new and fairly terrified Court of Appeals judge, Neil understood that immediately, and he undertook to befriend me and mentor me and talk to me about the things that worried me about my new job in an effort to make me feel more secure in that position and to maybe inspire me to do better work, which he did. And one of the things that we've talked about is our responsibility in this profession to hand it over in good condition to the generation that follows. And I think that's very much what Neil had in mind when he took the time to come and have lunch with me about once a month or so when I was new on this court, and really was a supporter and mentor, and much appreciated by me.
And I think when we talk about the question we've got here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that question in a little while, what is the role of lawyers beyond service to their clients? I think that mentoring role is absolutely crucial. I can remember straight out of law school, I clerked for Griffin Bell on the old Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the generational aspects of that relationship, all the clerks would meet for dinner once a year. Even when he was Attorney General, we all flew up to Washington and had dinner in the Attorney General's office. And it was that kind of relationship that continued until the very end of Judge Bell's life. And I'm sure that your law clerks feel the same sort of thing, and we'll have more opportunities to talk about the generational aspects of the legal profession. But Richard, you might want to say a few words about your relationship with Neil.
Sure. When I started, Neil was, the luminary, head of the firm, and when you're starting your practice, it's not easy. You're trying to figure out how you fit in. You're trying to figure out what the long-term pathway is, and the tone from the top, right? And Neil just set an extraordinary tone, both in what he said and also what he was doing, to be a role model. You mentioned mentors, and I'm a believer in you have immediate mentors and you have silent mentors, people who you throughout your life look at and admire and may not communicate directly with day to day. I see many of them in this room who've been silent mentors. And so Neil was, always came away from every encounter with Neil just feeling a little bit better, feeling like that the dialogue had been elevated. He loved words. And he always had a phrase. He knew that words mattered. He used to say, this thing we call the practice of law. And he said that, and he always had this sort of private sense of amusement that he had been doing it for so long, but he was still just practicing. And so, many fond memories.
Well, after I clerked for Judge Bell, I had a little tour of duty in the United States Army. And I spent the first year in Baltimore, and then I got to spend the second year in Vietnam. And my older son, Benjamin, who's now 45, was then not quite 1 year old. And so we came back to Atlanta. And I had accepted a job with what was then Alston, Miller & Gaines. And by sheer happenstance, Ann, my wife, sang in the Atlanta Symphony Chorus along with Sue and Neil's sister, Sue, who has forever since been known as Sister Sue. And Neil and Sue and Sister Sue took Ann under their wing during that whole year. And when I started to work at the law firm on June the 1st of 1971, which incidentally was exactly 10 years to the day after Neil Williams started on June 1st of 1961, Neil became someone who was just a constant mentor. Now, we didn't practice together very often because I was in the litigation section and Neil was dealing with all the corporate giants of the firm at the time and helping start businesses like Print Pack and National Data and companies like that. And that relationship continued, obviously, after I succeeded Neil. And I'm sure Neil thought I was just following him around from job to job. He would get involved at Duke, and I would be involved at Emory, and he was at the Symphony, and I was at the Symphony, and he was this. But the richness of the relationship really came to its full fruition when we were both retired, and we would give each other books at Christmas, and then we would insist that we were going to have a lunch where we discussed the book. And so we would discuss Neil's book, and then I would discuss my book, and it was just a very rich intellectual relationship that allowed me to see so many different aspects of Neil and what made Neil a great lawyer. And sometimes I would ask Neil, and I'm going to ask each of you, why did you become a lawyer? What was that all about, Judge?
Well, I wish I had a better answer, but the truth is I adore my father. And he was a lawyer, as was his father, and as was his father. And so some people say it's just a genetic defect. I don't know. But, I mean, honestly, my goal was to have more things to talk to my father about. And it was a fairly successful formula. I talk to him, still most days. And we have some exchange about what I'm doing as a lawyer. So it worked. How about you?
Right. I likewise don't have sort of the sexy response to that. But I guess from my standpoint, I had a sense, even in a fairly indefinite way, that that's where things could happen. And whether through studies in school or whether observing community leaders and others who were lawyers, it was a strong sense that that was a pathway to other things, and that's where the action was. And so not a lot more thought than that. I actually had taken the MedCats and was getting ready to go to medical school and said, no, that's not the pathway. And so ended up jumping in.
Well, my experience was not unlike Judge Martin's. Many of you is Martin Snow, Grant and Napier, is that still the name of the firm?
I think, yeah, they call it Martin and Snow now, I think.
I spent the first probably 10 years of my career in a case called the Independent Bankers Association versus Jackson. And the opponents in that case were Cubbage Snow of Martin Snow, Grant and Napier. And so Beverly comes from a rich legal family in the history of Georgia. And I sort of was born into the law. My father had gone to Emory Law School in the Depression, and he had worked at what was then Sutherland, Tuttle, and Brennan, and he always considered that Elbert Tuttle was his greatest mentor, and his colleague was Randolph Thrower, and I sort of grew up, and my father only practiced law in the private practice for a short period of time until World War II. And after that, he decided he was going to be a law professor. And then he decided he was going to be in the state Senate, and he was a deputy attorney general, and he was so enthusiastic and excited about what he could do in the law and with the law and what the law could do. And of course, that was the time when To Kill a Mockingbird was. We were all reading it for the first time, and we were watching Gregory Peck in the movie, and we were watching our whole society change as a result of what the law was about. And so it was just something I never thought about doing anything else. Now, I said we were going to talk a minute about this question. What is the role of lawyers beyond service to our clients? Now, when we started off, we knew we wanted to have a program that dealt with the law, but how were we going to do it? You know, were we going to talk about how the law practice has gone to hell, or were we going to talk about, you know, nostalgia therapy or what? And so I said, well, since it's Neil asked, I guess we've got to come up with a question. So I said, how about this? Who do lawyers serve? And we got in a long, no, it's whom do lawyers serve? So after a lot of argument about whether it was who or whom, we decided to come up with what is the role of lawyers beyond service to their clients. So it's all about who or whom, okay? Now, I don't like the question because it sort of implies that service to the clients is not the heart of the issue. And I've always been sort of amazed that lawyers, all too often, were almost embarrassed to be lawyers. So they pretended that they were philanthropists, or they pretended that they were educators, or they pretended that they went and did legal aid on Saturday morning once a month, or stuff like that. When what lawyers really do, I always wanted to see lawyers say, I'm proud of what I do. Lawyers play different roles in a process that provides the infrastructure of civilization. It's about as simple as that. And so if that's the case, and if everybody likes law and order, why is it that everybody hates lawyers? I gave a talk at the Atlanta Rotary Club one time, and I started the talk off, it was on Law Day. And I said, I bring you greetings from America's most beloved profession. And I got more laughs with that line. So I then figured it out. The way to get the audience on your side, if you're talking about the law, is start off with 5 minutes of lawyer jokes. And everybody will say, oh, this is just so neat. You can warm up the audience. So why is it that if everybody loves law and order, everybody hates lawyers?
I think a large part of it is just rationalizing, is embedded in the notion of just the way the adversarial system works. You have a side, there's another side, you assemble the great brains to pull together briefs and make arguments, and the other side does the same thing, present it, and there's often a winner and a loser, and that can leave bruises, and that can leave a lot of dissatisfaction. I also think that that the notion that lawyers take sides, even if it's wrong, is perceived as being dishonest. And so there's I'm reminded of this whenever I go home and talk with folks who are not lawyers and say, well, how can you defend, or how can someone defend Roger Pistorius or whoever it is, someone who they think is so clearly guilty? And there's a perception that there's some dishonesty about that. And I think part of the role that we play and we have to play is to bring about a better understanding of the way our system works, so that there's confidence in the framework and there's confidence in the system. And that is detached, or can be detached, from perceptions about individual lawyers' roles within it.
I'm going to take the other side of that. Maybe this is a little elevated above the who-whom debate, but I don't think that people hate lawyers. There are so many people, from my perspective, that find themselves in the federal judicial system. They don't want to be there. They don't understand it, and they need help. And so one of the most gratifying things about my job is finding young lawyers often to take on these indigent clients. And just in case after case, there was a young man that I appointed. He said the first deposition he ever took was in this case where he's representing an inmate in the Chattooga County Jail, this inmate was confined to a wheelchair. He couldn't get to the facilities, to the bathrooms, and so it was very hard for him to survive in that environment. And this young man, this young lawyer, went in and represented him, and they had to do a construction job on the Chattooga County Jail to get it in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, the people in Chattooga County said to this young man, look, we've been wanting to do this, but we really kind of needed somebody to file a lawsuit before we could justify it to the people in control of the money in Chattooga County. And then on the other hand, the inmate is just worshipful of Mike Kaplan, who did this for him. The greatest thing that ever happened to me, Mr. Kaplan, was when I met you, and you've made such a difference in my life. And I see that over and over. I'm going to make a plug for two of your lawyers, if you don't mind.
Great.
So, associates at Alston & Bird are busy. They have a lot of requirements on them about how much time they have to bill to their clients. But I got a letter from two young associates here at Alston & Bird volunteering to represent somebody who couldn't afford a lawyer. And so I appointed Meredith Kingsley, and Jenny Mendelson to represent a woman in a civil case. And it's particularly hard, I think, to find lawyers in those cases. We didn't compensate them. And I remember, I didn't know them, but it turned out that I was hearing the appeal of the case that Jenny and Meredith argued beautifully, I might add. And I walked by the courtroom, and there was Jenny and Meredith talking to their client, and the client was just hanging on every word they said. I can tell you she didn't hate lawyers at that moment. She was thrilled to have these young women represent her, and they represented her very well. So I think maybe you're traveling in the wrong circles.
Well, I did see a poll recently that indicated that we're doing better than politicians in the media. So we won't get to the priesthood, but I think we may catch the doctors.
Last Saturday's New York Times had an article that pointed out that the number of law school applications, which was 100,000 in 2004, had dropped to 54,000. And that reminds you a little bit back when Dan Quayle was vice president. They took some polls, and basically the polls suggested that the two most hated groups in America were lawyers and the IRS, and so he started going around making speeches, and one of his speeches was, why are 70% of the lawyers in the world Americans? Why do we have 70% of the world's lawyers? Well, of course, we didn't. The figure was totally fanciful. But we do have 10% of the world's lawyers. And are there too many lawyers?
No.
Well, I'm always eager to point out that we have a fairly unique culture in America. We have a very, very competitive culture, but we also believe that there are basic protections to shield people from some of the bruises of the protection. We've got a very diverse society. We honor free speech and free expression, and we've got the world's strongest economy. And if you look at our percentage of the gross world product, the U.S. has 20% of the gross world product. If you look at wealth, I'm involved with Invesco. There are assets under management is a term that Barry Berlin knows well. But assets under management is that pot of wealth that somebody is managing somewhere. And the total global assets under management right now are $56 trillion. And of that $56 trillion, $26.3 trillion is held in the United States. The United States is a destination for the world's wealth and has accumulated a lot of the world's wealth because we've got a legal system that protects investment expectations. I read an article in last week's New York Times that said 40% of the co-ops, condominiums, and townhomes that are being sold in New York are being sold to foreigners. I mean, and that's because people feel like that there's a safety associated with America, and the same thing is true, the same phenomenon is true in London and other places where there's a well-developed sense of law. And so I think the argument can be made that we get pretty good value as a society and as a country because we've got a well-developed legal system. Now, we were having a little discussion yesterday, and I asked the question, all right, now, let's pretend that, we're so smug in that comment I just made about our wonderful legal system. If we were going to talk about the U.S. legal system in terms of a batting average, like a baseball player, would we be batting 400 or 235 or 110? What do you think the state of the American legal system is? What would you give the batting average, Richard?
I would first point out that by asking and using the baseball analogy, it sort of suggests that you're going to be below 500. I mean, if you're hitting it 3 out of 10 times, then you're doing okay. I guess the grade I give varies based on the different roles that I see lawyers play or should play, and I guess fundamentally break those down into 3 different broad categories. I think that representing the clients, right? I mean, clearly significant role. I give a pretty good grade on that, pretty good batting average, probably over 300. Then there's the role that we serve as officers of the court, have to respect the court, having to play a role in the administration of justice, separate and apart from the roles that we serve with the clients. And I think do a pretty good job there. Maybe a little bit lower than the 300. And where I give us the lowest grade is in the third role that I think of, which is separate and apart from the client. And lawyers have a responsibility and play a role in just maintaining the whole justice system and ensuring the quality of the system. And so when you ask, do we have too many lawyers, the first thing that comes to my mind is, how can we have too many lawyers when so many don't have access to the system and so many are not represented? Now, that may be a comment not on the number of lawyers, but rather on a more general observation about the system and the structure. But when it comes to the roles that we play as public citizens, right, to work on the administration of justice and to do things apart from representing clients, I see so many good things, but that's where I probably give us the lowest score.
Judge?
Well, when we talked about this yesterday, since I'm the part of the legal system that produces, opinions saying what the law is, I better be doing better than 500.
Right. And is that I would distinguish between the role of lawyers and versus the court, which I think's 700 or 800. Henry Aaron type home runs.
You're batting 1,000 with me.
Well, as we talked about this yesterday, I mean, one of the observations that I always try to make is that the court system that I'm privileged to be a part of is probably, closest to a perfect institution as I deal with. Unfortunately, it's populated with imperfect human beings, so we're not going to bat 1,000, but I think the adversarial system that you described provides us with what we need to get it right, and shame on us if we don't.
I've often talked about Judge Learned Hand as one of my heroes, and in fact, Neil got the Judge Learned Hand Award from the American Jewish Committee in 2006. And one of the quotes that I often use, he said, "The condition of our survival in any but the meagerest existence is our willingness to accommodate ourselves to the conflicting interests of others, to learn to live in a social world. It's here that we can find our scope and meaning in our work as lawyers, which raises it out of the dusty routine of gaining our living. For the law is no more than the formal expression of that tolerable compromise that we call justice, without which the rule of the tooth and claw must prevail." And we hear so much these days about people's unwillingness to compromise, as though if you compromise a political position that is fixed, that somehow you're compromising important principles. And the law by its very nature deals with conflict. It deals with your interest and my interest are different. And whether you're talking about gun control or abortion or any issue, it strikes me that our society really, not everybody wants to see things compromised. It's almost contrary to human nature. And so how does the law deal with that sort of fanaticism that we see where, we can't have any compromise? You see it in the judicial system. We've got 4 vacancies on your court right now, right?
Right. Out of the full number would be 12. So we're now doing the work of the court with 8 active judges.
And you may not want to get into this, but the reasons have to do with extreme partisanship with regard to the judicial appointments. And it's not like it's one party or the other necessarily. It's just, how do we get that fixed? There's a litmus test for any, if you are going to be the next appointee to the U.S. Supreme Court, there would be people that would be very frustrated that you've never written an abortion opinion.
I mean, one would think that that's what judges do, is sit around and deal with these hot-button topics. But I've been a federal judge for 14 years, and I've never had anything resembling an abortion case, and I hope my luck continues, actually.
But if you had had one, you would be probably disqualified for some reason or other.
I don't know. That's a good idea. But you know, most of what we deal with, Ben, is you talked about yesterday. A lot of what we deal with is process. Did the process happen the way it was supposed to, or on the other hand, if somebody did something, were they the right person to do it in terms of whether it's the state or the federal government or which branch of government? And so often we don't really get to was what they did right or wrong. Did the right person do it, and did everybody involved get the process that they were entitled to?
Well, let's talk a little bit about some threats to the legal system. The dean of the Harvard Law School was giving a paper on the state of American law, and she said there's a catastrophic drop taking place in funding for courts and legal services for the poor, putting the institutions of the legal system at risk of collapse and jeopardizing perceptions and realities of justice. I hear from judges all over the country that they're now worried about the capacity of their courts to proceed. And she goes on pages and pages of examples of where the court budgets have been reduced, the number of judges has declined, the backlogs are years and years. And how serious a problem do you think that is, Judge?
Well, I worry about that a lot, and here's why. When you have a busy court like ours is, and my court takes appeals from all federal cases in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, and we are staffed with 12 active judges. Blessedly, we have judges who have taken senior status. They're not active judges who help us with our caseload. But in 1981, when the 11th Circuit was formed, the population of the three states was somewhere, well, the 1980 census was 19 million in those three states. The 2010 census says that there are 33 million people in those three states. And when we're fully staffed, we have 12 judges, but as you mentioned, we now have 8 active judges. And the thing that worries me about that is that the workload doesn't change. So you've got fewer people addressing more cases, each one of which involves the most important thing going on in somebody's life. And what happens with the shortage of judges is that you have to deal with those cases more quickly, less thoughtfully. You make more mistakes, and I go to bed at night thinking about someone reading an opinion that I wrote, and they read it and say, "Well, but that's not what happened," because I didn't have time, or we didn't have the resources to look back into the record and check every single thing. And so I think that brings disdain onto the court. And I think that's the biggest enemy of the court. Whatever happens in the legislative branch, I mean, I think it's part of the tradition of our country that each branch of government gets impatient with the other branches of government. So I think, that's not so much what I worry about. I think that's probably a sign that things are working the way they're supposed to. But what worries me is being so understaffed that we can't do a good job on the job that's been entrusted to us. And I think, my primary obligation is to pass along the courts to the next generation of lawyers in as good a condition and with as good a reputation as it was given to me. And I think the shortage of judges
Yeah, I think that is a significant threat, because the confidence in the court that we talked about a moment ago clearly is tied to a sense that there's thoughtfulness, and that however it turns out in a way where there was thoughtful consideration. And when that is strained, then it erodes the confidence. And that, of course, is not good. Something I would say in terms of threats, different is that this is something that I guess Justice O'Connor has surfaced, but I do believe that the constitutional guarantees to due process and a fair trial are threatened by the campaigning and having judicial elections, and all that we're seeing in response to the impact and the influence that those elections can have on the judges. So I view that as a threat. That's more at the state level, of course, but I think that's something that seems to be worse now than it was.
May I follow up on that?
Sure.
So part of the oath that we take as federal judges, and I believe it's the same oath that the state judges take in Georgia, and the oath comes from the Judiciary Act of 1789. It's nothing new. It's part of what the courts. I mean, it sets up what we are supposed to do, what we've always been charged with doing, and that is that all of us take an oath to administer justice without respect to persons and to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. And so, and of course, I'm protected because I'm given lifetime tenure. And the Constitution provides that my Congress can't take away my pay when they get mad about something that I do. And so the cost of that is, or what I have sworn to do in exchange for the protection that I've been given in my job, is that I've got to stand with the most despicable human being on the face of the earth if their rights have been violated. That's my job, and that's why I've been given lifetime tenure, to allow me to do that. And so when you do that, you get dirtied up a little bit yourself. And so people can point to these cases where you've had to stand with the most horrible criminal, death row inmates, that sort of thing, and say, she thinks what this person did is okay. She ruled in his favor. Well, that's not what it is. Again, it's back to, the Constitution has certain processes in place for the poor and the rich, and were those processes followed, even for the most unpopular causes. And so that's when elected judges get attacked, for really doing what they're charged with doing and what they took an oath to do. I'm protected, so. But I think you're so right about that.
I think that the independence of the judiciary has to be tied to what you're saying, and that seems to be, there are just more and more instances now, it seems, and at the state court level where there's campaigning and there are legislatures in robes?
I had indicated at the outset that we were going to take questions at about 15 or 20-minute point, and we're getting close to that. I want to throw out one other issue before we throw the floor open, and that's the whole notion of law on a global sense. I mean, we are, as bad as it is, and I don't think I would give my batting average for the legal system wouldn't get to 200, I don't think, because of access issues and attacks on the independence of the judiciary and on and on and on. But if you think about the global scene, it's really scary because David Brooks had an article that appeared about a week ago. It was both in the Atlanta Journal and the New York Times, and it was entitled "The Republic of Fear." People in many parts of the world simply live beyond the apparatus of law and order. The District of Columbia spends about $850 per person per year on police. In Bangladesh, the government spends less than $1.50 on police. The cops are just not there. In the United States, there's one prosecutor for every 12,000 citizens. In Malawi, there is one prosecutor for every 1.5 million citizens. The prosecutors are just not there. Even where there's some legal system in place, it's not designed to impose law and order for the people. It's there to protect the regime from the people. How much does the island in the world that respects law, how much does that bother you?
Well, it bothers me. It also ties back to what you were saying earlier about the law and lawyers reflect the development of the social structure and the economic structure. And we have more lawyers here, but we also have the strongest economy, social, and political order of all time. In terms of the instability, I think it is a problem because some view, if there's only one prosecutor for 1.5 million, then some view it as, well, that they're deprived of what is essentially a luxury. But that's not the case because without the structure of the law, life is short, nasty, and brutish, right? And people resort to violence, and I think you see a direct correlation between that in those countries and those where there are more constraints. But the thing I would want to add to that is there is a lot of discussion around the law and to what extent it can provide the structure. And obviously the premise of our country and society is that people are able to pursue their own self-interest and their goals within the constraints of rules and laws, but the law is not enough. There has to be more to it than that. If people stop at red lights only when they think a cop is looking, or if they're willing to exhaust the limited resources of the traffic court just to argue that it was green, then the system falls apart. And so it's that the cultural and customs that are added to the law that I think need to be present.
One further note on the global scene. I found it very, very interesting as Russia has seemed to move more and more away from any sort of real respect for law. And with this most recent example in the Ukraine, the inability of anybody to want to invest money in Russia. And, I mean, they can't sell their bonds. It's amazing to see the global reaction that is set in motion when a country just says we're just going to ignore the law. All right, we've got some microphones. Where's Monica? All right, anybody want to?
Thank you. I'm not an attorney, so I might not frame the question correctly, but I'm curious what you all would have to say with regard to the efficacy of the judicial system after a ruling like Citizens United. I guess what I'm asking is if what is going to be the sort of template in a case like that is this very strict reading of the Constitution, and there's a concern about what are people's perceptions of the judicial system or even just our system of government. What do you think are the ramifications after a ruling like that?
I mean, it's the law, and I'll follow it. Right? I mean, you all may have some other observations, but that's.
The question is to what extent does it push back to the legislature, right? And to what extent are there other forms of relief around that? I mean, the court very clear that here is where we are, and the judges will enforce it without regard. And the commentary about that outside has been, well, that's the lay of the land. That's the law, and so it pushes things to the legislature, of course, for change. And I think that's where the role of lawyers can come in. This duty to tend to what I think of as the repair and reform of the framework. I mean, there are lawyers, it might even be the majority view that that's not our role. In other words, we're forceful advocates for our clients and for the positions in that or other cases, and the chips fall where they may. And it's up to the courts, it's up to the legislature, it's up to the public attorneys to tend to those things, but the only rule that we follow as private lawyers is that we just have to stay within the rules. And I personally disagree with that. I think that lawyers do need to play more of an active role in articulating the pros and cons and arguing for change, separate and apart from the lawyers. I mean, separate and apart from representing clients.
I think you all are right that the first duty of the lawyer is to his client. But I think a perspective that was strong in Neil Williams' mind was service to the community. You all talk about 1961, 1971. I went to work for Buster Bird, Francis Marion Buster Bird, one of our named partners, on September the 1st, 1949. And a few days later, he said to me, he said, "Bob, the community has given us as lawyers a monopoly on the practice of law. We're it with the practice of law. And it is up to us to give back to the community. And I want you to remember that in all of your practice years." I tried to do that. And Mr. Bird's boys and girls, men and women, lived up, in my opinion, to that challenge, if you will. I looked around and I didn't see many people here from the late 1800s when the Alston brothers started their firm. But my observation over 60 years is that its boys and girls, its men and women, have followed that tradition of service to the community. And that is personified by Neil Williams, in my opinion. So let's not forget that aspect, and I know you haven't.
Anyone else?
One thing I would add to that is I think it's important to agree, is that our profession is largely self-governed, right? And whether it's through admission to the bar, whatever it is, and ultimately the final decision maker for the profession is the court within the profession, right? And so that privilege, I agree, of self-government requires an involvement in the community or the system that's not just to pay back, but rather is an essential part of making it function in a way that is going to be successful longer term. And it comes, I think that lawyers that lose sight of that, it threatens the independence of the judiciary and also threatens the ability of self-government.
I'm pleased to say that all the lawyers that I know in Atlanta who are outstanding, I've met in their community engagement roles. And it includes Neil, it includes Ben, it includes Joe Bankoff. But my question really is the perception of lawyers. What has the advertising by law firms done to that reputation? I was talking recently to a personal injury lawyer, and she said, I really can't make much of an impact because the only people that people know are the ones who advertise on the back of buses. They are on radio, they are on television. When did this advertising start, and are there rules about how to present the firm in that public scene?
If you've been hit, call Neil Flint.
That's right.
Well, I, like many of the people in the room, can remember well when Philip Alston was just offended at the notion that a lawyer might have a business card. That's changed. You walk in here and we've got flashing stuff about, we've got an expert in this field and we were ranked well in this field. And it's like so many other things. I think we got into this because there used to be rules against it.
He's too nice to say you blame the courts for that. Before I got there, but I think it was a...
The courts said there is such a thing as free speech. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard for people to hear the speech they don't want to hear. And there's also free speech that's repulsive. And you just have to ultimately depend on the taste and discretion of the profession to decide whether you want to put your name on a bus or not.
Right. We don't. And we don't. I think that if you look back over what the last 50 years or so and say what has changed or what have been the most significant events in the profession, I would identify, I think that's a New York Times opinion, I would identify two things. The decision to allow lawyers to advertise and the decision by magazine, The American Lawyer, to publish the financial statistics of certain law firms. Those two things to me have changed the practice dramatically. I would probably give, I see real advantages to the advertising, and I think that those are related to, fundamentally the market and the ability to seek out services by a greater number of people. And if you're hit, you may not know to call Neil Flint, right? And so I think that that's still in process. I think that the market segments, and there are certain segments within the market that will depend on advertising, and I think that is ultimately a healthy thing.
All right, it's 11 o'clock. I'm going to end on another learned hand quote. In thousands of chambers, committee rooms, and lecture halls, the spirit of the law becomes incorporate, and neither you nor I nor any individual shall have much part of it. We're the workers in the hive. We shall not be missed, nor shall we be able to point at the end to any perceptible contribution. But the hive goes on, an entity, a living thing, a form, a reality. So far as we cannot severally link our fate in its fate, we shall not have our reward. Though severally we may perhaps be paltry and inconsequent, for the present it is we who are charged with its maintenance and its growth, descended to us in some sort, molded by our hands, passed on to the future with reverence and with pride. We at once, its servants and its masters, renew our fealty to the law. And I think that's what Neil spent his life doing, and I think he set an example for the rest of us. Thank you. Do grab another cup of coffee and enjoy fellowship.